Malibu Sheriff's territory extended beyond George's property. They may have noticed more horseback riders than usual, or more beards on the western set, or more girls going in and out of his house. 2 deputies stopped in to visit him, to see if he was all right. He said he told them he had a new bunch living in the back farmhouse and quite a lot more help. The officers referred to us as hippies. George told them that he didn't think we were hippies. Upon leaving, they told him to be sure and call if he needed anything. When he told me about it, I said I didn't think they would come to clean the barn, and he laughed. I found my niche with George. I have read and heard that Charlie assigned me to spend my days with George. That wasn't true. George and I had an easy rapport, but I wasn't the only one who visited George. Most of the girls stopped in to see him at least once a day. When the Cowboys came cussing into the house to eat, some of us were there to keep the peace and clean up their debris. Incidentally, we heard their notions and stories in between their complaints. One day I heard Randy Starr talk about bandits. He seemed to believe that Mexican bandits inhabited the hills behind the ranch. Then I realized that he was talking about dead people. Ghosts. They were rebel Mexican robbers of the 1800s, part of Californian lore. He was particularly interested in the outlaw, Joaquin Murrieta. According to Randy, one of Murrieta's lifetime haunts had been in the hills, near the Indian Mesa, and his ghost sometimes hovered up there, over his stolen gold. I just might get serious one day and find it, Randy mumbled as he went out the door. I hoped he wouldn't go looking because we sometimes visited the Indian Mesa. From George's house, we girls could hear and see the cars of people coming to rent horses. George liked us to run to the rental office and get a look at the people, then run back to the house to tell him of their sizes and behaviors so that he could choose their horses. Panting, we stood before him saying things like, "There's a man in his 30s, about 5'8", kinda stocky. Says he has ridden a lot and wants a fast horse." George might say, "Tell Pearl to give him Fred." So we'd run back to the office, knowing that Fred wasn't very fast. So George had a hunch that the guy was bragging. He had to protect the braggarts so that they didn't kill themselves, and the horses so the people didn't run them to death. One time a horse got so lathered it appeared to be covered in shaving cream, and Pearl was so mad she yelled at the rider and made him walk that horse for half an hour. After telling Pearl of George's choices, she usually agreed, unless she was mad at him. She either argued and did what she wanted, or she skipped the argument. We scrubbed down the walls in George's house and put up old Western movie posters. He began calling it the Hall of Fame or the Celebrity Room. We swept the narrow steps he theatrically called the stoops of the veranda. I sometimes sat there with him, breathing the breeze and shooting it too. One day, Bobby Beausoleil blew into town in a '56 Ford truck with a dog named Bo and a quarter horse named Soleil. He gave the horse to George. Another day, it was with 2 women and a Model T in tow. But this time, he brought just 1 woman and a full-sized teepee. They were coming from the set of an independent movie where they'd been oddly cast as American Indians and living in teepees on the set. The woman had a polished look, olive skin, long, dark, shiny hair, and plenty of cleavage at the V of her suede wrap dress. When I offered to help her gather her things, she introduced herself as Gypsy, and, laughing, she confided her first meeting with Bobby. I had seen him on set, she said, and I invented an excuse to go into his teepee. But he was playing his guitar and he ignored me completely. So I talked to his girlfriend, Gail, and suddenly Bobby stops playing. He looks at me and says, "Do you play the violin?" I said, "You must have heard me." He said, No, I'm looking for a violin player." So I went and got my violin, we played together, and I moved into his teepee that night. "What about the girlfriend?" I asked. "What about Gail?" She said, "Oh, we went through a lot of changes at first. But Bobby was always talking about Charlie and all you girls. And, she smiled. "And I've been waiting to meet you." Gypsy went inside the saloon to unpack, and something happened. She came to me saying that she had just met Charlie, and he got mad. And now he was leaving the ranch. She wanted to know if she had done something wrong and what she could do. Charlie left the ranch often, but not usually on foot, and not usually mad. Finally, I said, "Well, go after him then." By dinner, they were back. Gypsy said that halfway down the mountain, he had yelled for her to leave him alone. But before the bottom, he'd agreed to return. And after dinner, we hoisted Bobby's big teepee in the front yard and went in to smoke a pipe. Randy Starr was fuming. "We goddamn son of a bitches had come barreling in and took over the ranch." So some of the girls turned the jail into a sheriff's office and stuck a sign reading, "Randy Starr, Sheriff," above the door. And he simmered down and seemed to feel more important. The most talented and physically attractive among us, Bobby was not one feather ready to settle down. I don't know how many times he came and went, bringing and leaving girlfriends, but eventually Gypsy and pretty brunette Leslie Van Houten chose to settle on the ranch. Leslie was a modest doll, in 1920s parlance, with a slender neck and hair bobbed a la flapper. Sweet and smart from the get-go, she proved to have a good, fast brain. A couple of weeks after Gypsy arrived, she told me that she had just seen a near-naked man in the hills above the ranch. She and Brenda had been taking afternoon hikes, completely naked, to a plateau above the ranch from where they could see the entire valley. And on this day, she'd seen the man squatting on a boulder, watching them. She said, The instant I spotted him, he uncoiled like a snake, sprang off the rock like a lion, and disappeared. Before she could alert Brenda, Brenda smiled and told her, "He always follows us." He was Steve, the runaway Randy had told me about. I later spied him by the creek. He looked older than 16, tall and muscular with wide shoulders and a narrow waist. Another day I saw him on top of the haystack just watching us. His hair was the color of the hay. Ella referred to him as a fox and approached him. I saw them running and laughing together. Then I saw him talking to Charlie, and after that he came closer to all of us girls. Some of us were shy of him because he had no pretense. He wanted to make love to all of us, not just to lie down, but to steal the moments when we stood on the boardwalk talking, to slide up, wrap his arms around us, and move us like Charlie did. I saw Steve and Charlie shirtless one day, laughing in the hot sun. They were limbering up, rolling their shoulders and necks, letting their arms dangle. Charlie moved his pelvis, acting silly at first, then all around smoothly. He said, "Come on, man, move your hips. How's a guy gonna fuck if he's afraid to move his hips?" Steve came into our circle. He was learning to play the guitar. His singing voice was clear and of good quality. He came into our bed. It was a marriage of sorts. He was smart, tender, and funny. He picked up mountain talk from us girls and put on a character we named Clem. When nosy people came around asking too many questions, Clem was so dumb they walked away, sometimes in a hurry, thinking that he was demented. Evenings when the farmhouse looked comfortably slumped, its crooked outlines etched by the setting sun or the moon in a dusky sky, we were drawn, tired and hungry, to the orange light through the screen door and the simmering scents within. The front room filled, we ate, talked, and sang together. The music was the beginning of harmony. The mutt that the hippies left behind surprised us with 6 puppies that quickly outgrew her. One evening, after all the dogs had been fed, Charlie came into the farmhouse saying that we would have to feed the mother dog separately. Taking another bowl of food outside, he showed us that her rib cage was visible under a thin layer of fur. It disturbed him that neither he nor any of the rest of us had noticed her starving, while she allowed her wildly wagging offspring to eat all of her food. Then one day I came to the ranch front and saw the county dog catcher's truck in front of the saloon. Pearl and Randy had conspired. The catcher was pulling one of our big fluffy pups by a rope. Pearl scuttled around the truck, ordering Randy to grab that one, but his arms were already full, heaving another puppy into a cage and shoving it when it hedged. Vengeful satisfaction flushed his face when he saw me. The dogs had been up front too much. "Pearl," I whined, close to tears. "Why are you doing this? They don't cause trouble." Pearl tried not to look at me. "It's for the best," she finally said. It was her same testy tone with a fleeting sympathy. "We had to do something. We can't feed them all." "But we feed them," I yelled. "It'll be better for them," she declared. No, I said. They'll be killed. Somebody will adopt them, she contended. That's what the pound is for. And besides, she added suddenly from the bowels of her contempt, they're running wild. We can't have that here. And I admit, Pearl was right. Loose dogs reproducing randomly leads to feral packs that can wreak havoc on domestic and wildlife alike. But when she said they're running wild, I think she was talking about us. George had 2 dogs that Pearl fed before she left for the night. Tommy, a border collie mix he'd found as a starving puppy, and Wolf, who Larry said was part timber wolf. The dogs kept their distance when we first came, looking out the corners of their eyes at us. But soon they came to be petted and to lope with us to and fro the farmhouse. Days, we spread out in all directions. I don't think anyone knew what everyone was doing. I would later spend more time with Sandy than with any of the other girls, but at the time I knew her only as a refined and self-conscious beauty. She had been scarred, but I didn't know how or why. Sandy wore fresh cotton skirts or dresses. In the shower, I thought she would scrub her skin off. One day, when she and Charlie and I were going into town, the closer we got to civilization, the more she straightened her clothes and rearranged her hair. Grinning, he told her, "Relax. Stop thinking of what you look like. I love for the love shown to me, not what TV says is nice looking. I loved my grandma because she loved God and told the truth and made rice pudding." Sandy remained reclusive yet familiar. I'd see her at a distance, walking or riding a horse, a small figure against the blue sky in Sandy Hills, separate but fitting. George called her Sandra, as if in the presence of a dignified lady. Sandy. I was raised with what the English would call form, but no soul or love, gentleness or tenderness. Most of my life was never real to me, except when I was exploring on my bike through nearby neighborhoods in San Diego. At the ranch, my bike became horses. I had little riding experience, but I think I shared a dream with millions of girls of having my own horse. TV westerns were imprinted on my mind. The campfires, starry skies, and soft strumming of guitars. Cowboys ambushed behind boulders, shooting their way to safety, riding triumphant and proud through the sagebrush. Exploring the hills around Spahn's ranch on horseback was a dream come true. I didn't even know that many of the movies and TV shows I liked were filmed in those hills. The trails curved and climbed through chaparral, oak, and narrow passages that were sometimes bordered by giant lichen-covered boulders in colors of gold, bronze, browns, and greens. Tiny birds rustled in the brush, exploding out in a rush of air and sound as the horse came close. Sometimes I'd see tarantulas and horned toads. I rode bareback or with western saddle. Bonnie and Queenie were my favorites, and I could only ride them if paying customers didn't, which wasn't that often. But as soon as I lifted myself onto the back of a horse, the thrill was on. I loved to gallop. I didn't know where I'd end up or who I would meet if I'd get lost, so it was always an adventure. I talked to my horse once we got on the trails. I'd tell her how much I appreciated her carrying me. I'd been taught that you have to let a horse know who is boss. When I slowed to survey an area, the horses would often jerk their necks down to eat anything I let them eat. The more I gave in, the more they exerted their strength and will. Sometimes they tried to take over completely. The most dangerous part of the ride wasn't galloping on paths where a rattlesnake could spook the horse, but on the dirt road between George Spahn's house and the back ranch house, the road he called Lover's Lane. Lover's Lane was bordered by a species of oak with small leaves having holly-like points that could hurt if brushed against. They were also branches at the level of my neck. If the horse veered off the road, it became a power struggle. I was thrown a few times, and once at dusk I rode while on LSD, exerting no will of my own, but surrendering to the will of the horse. She galloped free and didn't try to knock me off by moving under the low branches or going far into the rocky hills. By nightfall, with just the smallest bit of prodding, she returned us both to the barn. After exploring the hills, I'd pretend to come to a house where I'd be invited inside for a hearty meal. Food was major to my sense of security. Ever since I got to the house in Topanga, I'd been impressed with the amount of food that filled the kitchen 3 or 4 times a week. This abundance appealed to me on a deep level. How much human history has focused on this one basic need, obtaining food in snow, ice, drought, and during wars, and up to modern times. Of what to select from the freezer, supermarket, the comparing of prices and spending of money. With garbage runs, cost and decision-making were done deals. Any food surprise might appear. I liked shopping outdoors, not having to make choices, not having to spend money, and most of all, not letting this precious food be wasted. Unconditional nurturance to be prepared in any ways one's culinary creativity could devise. Throughout my life, I'd had the fantasy of being a lone traveler, coming upon a warm, hospitable place where she is heartily fed. The closest I came to realizing this fantasy was at the ranch, but I was the most remote person there. I had never wanted to sit inside and talk. At nightly gatherings, Charlie often observed that Sandy was absent. Sandy was hiding. And maybe someone should go find Sandy. I was hiding. One time I took LSD and went up to the Indian Mesa. When I returned to the back ranch house, a communal meal was underway. I stole into the group, furtively gathered food, and retreated to some trees outside to quickly eat it. I had feral aspects, stealth, and fear. I wasn't a warm, cuddly, motherly female like some others at the ranch whom I was extremely jealous, especially the younger, less complicated girls. As an older female, I was sizing up the competition and trying to determine my place and status in the group. Despite the fact that I excluded myself, I didn't feel talked about or judged by the others, and I don't feel my opinions of them were based upon class. It was more like, does this person feel trustworthy, and are they kind? Are they helpful, bright, good-looking, and strong? I did come with a prejudice that more education meant more intelligence, but Charlie quickly blew that concept out of my brain. But But while education is equated with intelligence and other entire classes, ranch people exceeded my ingrained standards of qualities I sought in friends. I was the most broken, the most wounded, and the most in need of safety and kindness. And no one made me sing for my supper. They were cowboys to us, though the ranch had no cows or cattle drives. Pearl and George just called them the boys or the hands. Cowboys came and went, but 3 were fairly constant while we were there. Randy, Benny, and Larry. Randy Starr was stellar in his own mind. He'd been a movie extra, a trick writer, and occasionally, when drunk, sang, "You're cheating hard," at a low-end lounge in the valley. Sometimes at the ranch, he and his rough-riding teenage girlfriend put on shows. Slam the door. He'd come out of his trailer hollering, "Get your cock-sucking motherfucking ass out of there!" And he'd stride out to the middle of the yard. Crash the dishes. She and her long-legged Levi's would come out after him screaming, "You son of a bitch! You son of a bitch! You motherfucking dirty son of a bitch!" Boot to boot, teeth to teeth, they'd snarl at, kick at, and curse each other in a repeat performance, with variations of the fuckers and bitches. It happened almost every weekend, and Randy was such a good actor, he convinced even himself. He could sulk for days. Only audacity and access to horses had gotten Randy that girl to start with. He was twice into half her age, had pocked putty skin, a mangy mustache, a long nose with gaping nostrils, half-bad teeth, and hair slicked flat under his cowboy hat, the only evidence of which were greasy spears around his neck and ears. In addition to the black-gloved gimp hand, his body was bony and ill put together, and he was a bully. Yet Randy had a way about him that made us smile and wonder what he was up to, thinking that he couldn't be serious, and sometimes even liking him. All the ugly and disproportionate pieces aside. One day, Bobby Beausoleil was eager to go, but had given his truck to Charlie, as someone was using it. So they both approached Randy Starr about lending Bobby the famous movie and TV stuntman truck, in exchange for a new buckskin outfit and diamond ring. It was just an old pickup, but the giant sideboards advertising Randy's peculiar claim to fame made it one of a kind. I never expected Randy to lend it, but I saw Bobby drive it away. The archetypical villain, grinning and twirling the ends of his mustache. Cowboy Benny was older and scruffier, but he looked a little like Charlie. The similarity ended when he spoke. Benny was affably simple and shy. I saw him at night under a bare bulb in the bunkhouse playing cards with another cowboy. In the dead silence between cricket chirps, he looked slow and thoughtful. The smile in his stubble might indicate a good hand, but Benny could smile, win or lose, and just when I pegged him as clueless, he laid down the winning hand. His opponent groaned, and he laughed. Benny courted a gal who came some Sundays. She was just his height and about his age. her long brown hair in tight braids to her jeans. They strolled Lover's Lane, hand in hand, looking 20 years younger. Benny so modest and so proud. Then all of her children ran up behind her. 8 of them, under the age of 10, screaming, crying, and chasing each other. She swung at them. They ran away, circled, and came back to bother her again. In George's house, the 9th child, lying in a plastic cradle, was Benny's. A small, dark-haired, pale baby girl in diapers and an old pink dress. He came into the house to see her, holding her up carefully like he'd never seen her before. His face red and smiling, he looked at her again and again. Cowboy Larry was blonde and shorter than Benny, and had suffered brain damage as a child. He had a metal plate in his head, but you couldn't see it. Otherwise, he was not physically impaired, but impulsive. He could be ornery, occasionally on the verge of a tantrum, especially around Randy Starr. Larry compensated for his shortcomings by pretending. I could say that he outright lied, and sometimes he consciously did. But usually he unconsciously was imagining within the limits of his disability. One day, Charlie took me for a stroll around the front of the ranch, pointing out the colors, textures, construction anomalies, nails, wood slats, and knots. He said, "Look at the soul here." He showed me blue boards nailed to chipped peach 2x4s where sections of wood had been salvaged from old doors and windows to build something new and functional. He opened my eyes to the fading beauty of old barns and bunkhouses, rough-hewn fences, horse stalls, and sheds. Few people on the ranch fit into any classes and categories that I'd been conditioned to hold. The Cowboys were characters as soulful as the ranch itself. Weathered, raised without television, and with little schooling, they were a different breed from anyone I'd been exposed to, and their presence added warmth and richness to the place. The exception was Randy Starr, who was a dark, even sinister presence. He wore black everything. Even his old dusty Cadillac was black with his name emblazoned across the side in gold paint. He was sullen and he yelled a lot. I ignored Randy, but the others were always friendly to me. Charlie was sauntering across the yard one day, wearing a cowboy shirt, hat, and boots, and said that he and Larry had been in Abilene. Larry was from Abilene, and Charlie wasn't joking or making fun of him. Had been in Larry's world for a few hours. He looked and talked like Larry, and Larry looked proud. I brought them both cups of coffee, and Brenda made victuals. Slowly, it dawned on me that we, were all characters, and we could invent new parts for ourselves every day. The Cowboys didn't share that realization. Like most people, they were fixed in their roles. I was too uptight to play. I was in a tight trap of my history, and I felt only Charlie could free me. If he saw me having fun, even if I was just pretending to, he might leave me alone thinking I was fine. Sandra Good, a stockbroker's daughter, abandoned future financial security, cashed in her stocks and savings bonds, and invested the money in Charlie. He used it to buy a newer, bigger school bus that transported us all over California. It took the 5 girls and a supporting cast back to Ukiah for court, after which they were free to go, with time served and warnings. It broke down at San Jose and was parked for several nights in a plum orchard, where the passengers witnessed an uprising of drunken migrant workers on horseback, some of whom later dubiously explained that they were getting ready for a revolution in Mexico. And when all efforts failed to fix the bus, it was left in a parking lot until someone could get it, while its passengers hitchhiked back to the ranch. Some bus people arrived with a dumpling blonde, the likes of Mae West, in the factory-new Dodge camper van that her dad had just bought her. Her given name was Joan, but she called herself Juanita, as she was on her way to Mexico. Juanita had a sassy smile, a wink, and a way with innuendo, but she made no secret as to what she was after. Men who like blondes, tall, short, fat, or skinny. Charlie headed her off at the pass, and she gave him her van. We had a lot of cars at our disposal in those days. Dennis's Ferrari was parked by the bunkhouse for a while, but it was gone before I got a ride in it. I came out of George's house and saw Charlie walking across the yard towards Paul and Clem on the pass road. A bunch of interested people were coming out of the buildings, looking in their direction. Paul was grinning, Clem shrugging and looking sheepish. I got the story on relay. The 2 boys were returning from a test drive of Dennis's car when Clem misnegotiated a curve around a mountain. It was a wonder they both walked away. I was told that the car looked like a strip of bacon. Charlie eventually gave Dennis the new van that we got from Juanita so that Dennis could go on the road. Go see the Mendocino coast and the redwoods up north, Charlie told him. But Dennis only traveled to the home of his friend Greg and parked in his driveway. Preacher Dean and Charles Watson showed up at the ranch after Dennis gave up the lease on the estate. We couldn't have Ruth's father living in the same house with us, but Mary's father in Wisconsin owned a sporting goods store and had sent her a full-sized tent that we'd set up in the woods, so Charles and Dean went to live in the tent. After Dean left for another court date and didn't return, Charles moved up the hill, offering George Spahn his service as a mechanic. George said he liked a worker, man to man, but he couldn't pay more than the room, not even food. When Charles agreed, George asked if he could call him Tex, and they shook on it. George had plenty of vehicles for Tex to work on, cars and trucks that would never run again. Not because Tex didn't try, but because every movable part on them had been stolen or rusted shut long before we got there. Tex went to San Jose to repair and bring home our bus, taking along TJ, who had some experience working on old cars. TJ was a sometime visitor, older than most of us, balding, and missing front teeth for which he had loose replacements. He had already been through the military, demolitions, marriage and divorce, demolitions. Tex said that TJ was like a gypsy, and some would say more like a bum. However, with purpose, TJ was both resourceful and productive. He would later score not only marijuana and psychedelics, but transportation and weaponry. There was no synthetic marijuana back then. What we called grass and weed was nothing more than the leaves of a wild, unprocessed plant. Probably a quarter of the population in California smoked it, but it was untaxed, illegal, And we didn't know how serious our local sheriffs or city police were snagging people up for it. Sandy. At night, everybody gathered in a big circle in the saloon or at the back ranch house. The girls brought in dishes of food, and Charlie regarded the presentation as would an experienced gourmand, commenting on the aroma and the artistry. Maybe a sprinkling of flower petals on the salad, or sprigs of wild sage around the squash and rice. And the guys imitated his praise of the cooks. Slowly, too slowly for me, the dishes made their way around the circle. I wished I could have had the seeming lack of attachment to eating that Brenda, Pat, Lynn, and Leslie did. Sometimes I felt hostile towards anyone who held the bowls too long or took bigger bites. After the girls took away the dishes and the few forks and spoons were shared, one of them handed roll joints to each of the guys who lit them, taking a hit and passing them on. Someone handed Charlie his guitar, and at times he looked at it as if he were seeing it for the first time, like it was a new and sacred promise of pleasure. Tuning the strings, he might tap gently on the neck or body, while slightly cocking his head to hear the nuances of sound. This exploration could last minutes, and seemed wrapped with curiosity and anticipation. Meanwhile, Charlie was alert to outside sounds of voices, footsteps, and vehicles approaching or leaving. A sound we didn't hear could have him on his feet in a flash. He might step out into the night and be gone 5 or 10 minutes while we sat waiting. So much of my life has been waiting for something in the future. To go somewhere, to meet someone, to be seen, get asked out, go to college, and maybe get married. I was a little edgy, waiting. But Charlie was out under the stars, likely petting Wolfer or Tommy, and, like the dogs, sensing the environment. I wondered if he could encounter someone prowling around in the dark. Cops? Someone up to no good? And what would be the sound of his voice if he did run into someone? Would he sound warm and inviting, or sharp and loud, or stern with authority, or would he be laughing? Unlike anyone I'd ever encountered, Charlie wasn't waiting for life. Every moment in his world was alive, and he was alive in it. His reflexes were quick and sure, lacking the hesitations of fear and doubt. He didn't have to think about how to respond. He just did. I was filled with feelings from the past and with thoughts of the future, with how I looked and how much Charlie could read about my present state. It seemed everyone had become conscious of themselves. Katie, leaning forward, her thick brown hair falling down the sides of her face, would softly chuckle and admit to a new insight about her conditioning. Steve, or Clem, was 17, agile and handsome in a dusty, disheveled way that reflected his semi-wild surroundings. But he was self-aware enough to know he, too, had baggage to discard. As he shed his conditioning, you could see him blowing his own mind with fresh insights and realizations, grinning and shaking his head, whispering. Clem showed humility and the contrast between himself and Charlie, and made parody of the bashfulness he felt in the presence of so many pretty girls. Mary, Lynn, Pat, Ella, Brenda, and even Leslie and Snake were lighter and happier than friends from my past. But all of us had a new standard for what it was to be human. And we compared ourselves and all the other guys to Charlie. While Charlie was in Hollywood, he met a shiny new records producer who persuaded him to put some of his music on tape at a studio. When the producer invited him for a second session, Charlie urged all of us to come along. 16 to 20 people in various styles of dress hustled into the bus, many of us silently coaxing and kicking away ideas of becoming a successful recording group. In reality, although all of us could sing, some of us had yet to find a corresponding key. Charlie, Bobby, and Clem could have become successful on their own. But when I suggested to Charlie he go alone, he said, "What fun would it be without all of us together?" The studio technicians, a pair of balding men, were pissed. They were set up for a single musician. Charlie and the producer cajoled them in the sound booth, while other guys positioned extra microphones for a circle like we had at home. Despite technical opposition, the tape ran. It was a typical jam session. Clem and Charlie producing good instrumentals, Mary's flute and Gypsy's violin not half bad, and the elephant calls of Paul's French horn roaming a range between interesting and strange. But all of that in combination with Snake on a potato flute, several of us on knives and spoons, plus all of the voices created a cacophony, only barely related to music. The technicians blanched, but Charlie joked the whole time. He suggested we relax like we did at home, taking deep breaths, letting them out slowly, and then with sound. Behind closed eyelids, I saw the sounds take shape and color. They rose and wove around each other, branching and opening, then falling like leaves in the best harmony of the evening. Into the complete silence that followed, a technician's voice blasted. "Would you do that one again? We didn't have a level." Kathy Gillies, the blue-eyed daughter of Mr. High School teacher and Mrs. Entomologist, cantered by George's house on one of his best horses, her blonde hair flying. All of the guys were interested in her. The next time I saw her, she was lying on her stomach by the stone fireplace at the farmhouse, with colored pens, paper, and drawings splayed around her. She paid me no mind as I examined her quickly penned, and I thought exquisite, caricatures. When she began talking, it was of books. She seemed nice enough for a know-it-all. I would come to love Kathy as a mildly rebellious teenager, a lovely tomboy, and a reliable, enthusiastic storyteller, generous with details. George called her Capistrano from Santa Susano, or just Cappy. George told me to be careful nobody saw us sleeping in the buildings on the western set because it was against the law. With his fingers rubbing the stubble of a whisker he'd missed, his questions felt carefully around the real question of whether the fellas and the gals were sleeping together. I told him that we all slept in different places. I might put a sleeping bag down in the saloon or go all the way back to the farmhouse. I think he decided he really didn't want to know our sleeping habits, but I was aware that he was thinking of what he might do as a young man, and that it's not exactly easy thinking like a young man in an old man's body. The wide, unpaved yard in front of the movie set provided space for trucks, horses, and customer parking. It was parenthesized by 2 driveways coming off of Santa Susana Pass, one near George's house and one by the corral. This unintentionally allowed for road traffic to make drive-throughs and U-turns. The Malibu sheriffs cruised the yard more than once a week. It seemed they were bored. Let us see what those hippies are up to at Spahn's ranch. They'd idle if we were willing to talk, maybe looking for information. Maybe just to pass the time with barefoot girls and short dresses. We had to stay on our toes. One time a lady from the state or county called asking cagey questions about kids. "We run a horse rental business here, ma'am," I told her. "But are children there now?" "Riders, I reckon." "Are children living on the premises?" "What do you mean, the premises?" "Are children living on the property?" "I don't see no children, no." She didn't trust me, but she ran out of questions. "Mr. Spahn isn't here right now," I said. "But if you want to call back—" "Yes," she said. She would do that, but she never did. "You did right," George told me seriously. "Don't ever tell them there's kids here. They could shut me down, close the business, and condemn the ranch." "They've got no reason to do that," I contended. But he was angry. "Oh, you think they don't? You don't know. They as much as told me they could. Right now the city wants me to hook up to their water. We have underground springs here, you know. City water would cost me over $300 just to start, and I don't have it." Then, one day, a flat-topped government worker came to get a test tube of our water. He wanted the water from George's kitchen, and as he tiptoed through the house, he looked like he'd just eaten a lemon. George said if they claimed they found bacteria in the water, they tried to force him to hook up with city water. They didn't bother to tell him their findings, and for weeks he quietly worried about it. He said, "They'll lead your man dry if they can." George didn't like to talk like that. He wanted to be good for the memory of his mother and to respect the law. After the water question, though, he came up with a business proposal. Leaning towards me, he said confidentially, "I got an idea to make us a lot of money." "You do?" I yelped. "Now hush," he rebuffed. "Don't be telling every Tom, Dick, and Harry before I get a pen. I've got the formula for instant water." After some verbal tussling, he said, "You just put 2 of my little tablets in a jug. Then you add 4 quarts regular plain old water, shake it up. You got a whole gallon of genuine instant water. Like that idea?" Cowboys Benny and Larry got into a beat-up car every Saturday night and drove into Box Canyon to the Fountain of the World, a quiet religious retreat by day that turned lively on Saturday nights. "You ought to come," Larry hollered. "I'll be on stage tonight." Anyone who wanted to perform had their chance at the fountain, and Larry was a storyteller who never got his fill of ears. He'd give pointers on radio and stunt fighting, or riding and roping in the Southwest. Then, with the grandiose of a carnival barker, he'd leave word of where he'd be appearing next. But the following weekend, Larry would forgo his Madison Square Garden appearance and return to the Fountain of the World. We traveled in the bus to the religious community, parking beside the eponymous fountain that, by then, had gone dry. The buildings were reminiscent of Spanish Indian adobe, nestled between mountain boulders of near equal size. The only people living there were elderly women and a few younger monks in long brown robes, working and wandering between gardens and buildings without speaking. Inside the largest building, near an institutional kitchen, was a wide area filled with rows of chairs facing a curtained stage. They were soon filled by about 40 folks of all ages and descriptions from the neighboring communities. We watched a brief morality play put on by the monks, and then we were introduced to a teenage girl with flowing hair, who played her guitar and sang a folk song. Next came Larry, of whom we were ridiculously proud, and a variety of others. The mundane appearance of these shows gave no clue as to the sect's history. Once part of a larger congregation, the people were acolytes of Krishna Venta, an Aryan Eastern spiritualist who had used catacomb-like caves on the grounds for gatherings of an unknown nature. In the 1950s, Venta and about 20 people were blown to pieces inside the caves. Whether a conclusion was made as to the source of the explosives, no one was ever legally charged. Charlie speculated a sexual component to that story, but the oldest woman in the community would say nothing of the event, and of Krishna only. The master loved us. We visited the Fountain of the World several times before offering our help with their programs and community charities in exchange for a safe place for Mary and Sunstone to stay. Katie soon joined them, specifically to work, and she ended up managing their kitchen. Katie had an aura of invitingness. She'd slightly bend forward as if to energetically scoop you up into her warmth and hospitality. She'd extend a cup of coffee with a smile and a twinkle in her eyes. She often seemed on the verge of laughing, as if everything was potentially amusing. Like Brenda, Katie liked to serve and knew who was where, what they were doing, and about the time they might be wanting food and drink. She liked the company and conversation of the girls. I don't know which guys, if any, she was interested in, but since it was no Charlie made love with her, I'm sure some of the guys approached her sexually. Tex Watson was a problem solver with practical skills. At the farmhouse, people were collecting truckloads of wood to send up the highway above the pass for a project that was only whispered. One day I rode with the wood. We pulled to the side of the highway, got out, and waited for traffic to clear. Then we quickly tossed all the boards over the side of an embankment, got in the truck, and left. We didn't see the result of Tex's work for over a month, and then only after a long walk in moonlight, wending through woods, over rocks and under the highway, there appeared a thicket between two concrete abutments, and the building was beneath it. Tex had labored to dig out a foundation and rocky ground for depth and height, then built walls around the oddly shaped space. It was nice inside, big enough to hold all of us. We called it the in-case place, in case we needed extra space, in case we needed to lie low, in case anything. In one case, there was sex, some luscious, voluptuous sex. We were young and we learned from each other. There again, Charlie had cultivated nearly all of the women to yield to his motions, drawing us out of our minds and into our bodies, so to move us weightlessly. Without thought, sex became a sensuous dance, later conveyed wordlessly from us to other guys. I would describe the wet sheen of our healthy bodies, the softness in the muscle, but we'll suspend that tender tension. Not all of us could turn off our minds to experience ecstasy and peace, but we were on our way. Some nights we climbed the haystack and slept under the stars. Clem hollowed out beds by restacking the bales. We awoke with the sun, having been awake half the night. When the cornfields in the valley were harvested, George and Pearl took several cowboys to dinner with them, and an extra pickup truck with high wooden sides, and I got to ride along. After the meal, we drove to a big farm with acres of yellow corn. Most of it was being trucked to supermarkets or reserved for sale at roadside stands. But some was deemed unmarketable due to superficial flaws, and George paid a flat fee for as much of it as the cowboys could fork into his 2 trucks. On the way home, when corn bounced out of the trucks, George and Pearl blamed Randy and Larry for not tightening the tarps. Randy and Larry blamed each other, and I just rode along, feeling the dry September air through the open windows. We didn't get home till dusk. After getting George and the groceries inside, Clem, Brenda, Ruth, and the others of us climbed into the backs of the trucks on top of the corn. Under the stars, we ate a few of the sweet, juicy ears raw and separated the best into cardboard boxes for cooking. Randy opened the corral gate, and as Pearl drove each truck around inside the corral, the rest of us pushed mounds of corn into bins for the horses. A thrilling mumble of hooves arose as they trotted to and crowded the bins, chopping into the corn, husks and all. That week, everyone who wanted it ate fresh corn on the cob. We cooked big potfuls at the farmhouse and in George's kitchen. He had already told us that he would be generous, allowing us to have the more substantial middle course while he settled for the lumpy side meat. After we received a load of bananas, he was just as charitable, but it was the cobs he agreed to, while we could have the tender outer strips. During the autumn, at the farmhouse, dead wood smoke curled from the gray stone chimney, and pinpoint stars surrounded it. I met Clem and Cappy on my way one night, and the pupils of our eyes connected like long tunnels. Besides the attraction and the chemistry of our youth, we were excited by a belief in infinite possibility, on the edge of discoveries not only of our lifetime, but any lifetime. Charlie, there are more years in 24 hours than most brains can think. Think of all the heads that thought of art, music, mathematics. The caveman did not think up a cup or spoon or clock. Think of the hundreds of years it took numbers to come into play all the way to rocket ships and the all of all. It's as endless and vast as space, and you could mind travel it for 1,000 lifetimes, or become it in now. The one big memory is now. It was now then, as it's now.